They will tell you a king cannot bleed, that the man who conquered 6 provinces and buried 3 rebellions never once flinched beneath the weight of his own crown. They are wrong. Because the night Raylor Voss watched the only woman he ever wanted walk toward another man's throne. Something cracked inside him that no battlefield surgeon could name and no victory feast could fix. This is not a story about power. This is a story about what power cannot protect you from. Stay with me until the very end. If this world pulls you in, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. Let me see where my people are watching from tonight. What? The torches along the eastern corridor had burned low by the time the last servant swept through, and the silence that settled over the royal wing was the kind that made lesser men imagine ghosts. Raylor Voss did not believe in ghosts. He believed in borders, blades, and the unshakable truth that anything a man could not defend with his own hands was never truly his to begin with. He stood at the window of his private chamber, bare from the waist up, the scars across his back catching pale moonlight like a map of every war he had survived. 41 years old, 17 of those spent ruling Aurelion, and the face staring back at him in the dark glass looked exactly like what it was. Tired. Not weak. Never weak. But tired in a way that sleep could not fix and wine only worsened. His fingers rested against the stone ledge, calloused and cracked at the knuckles. The left hand still ached where a Northland raider had shattered 2 bones 6 winters ago. He flexed it now, a habit born not from pain but from the need to remind himself that he was still flesh, still something other than the title they hammered onto him before he was old enough to understand what it meant. A knock came. 3 raps. Measured. His steward, Aldrich, who had served since the old king's reign and who possessed the remarkable talent of never once asking a question that required an emotional answer. Enter. Aldrich stepped through the door, his gray head bowed just enough to satisfy protocol without crossing into groveling. Your Majesty, Crown Prince Lucian has finalized the tournament decree. The scribes will distribute it at dawn. Raylor did not turn from the window. How many houses confirmed? 14 noble families, 6 allied kingdoms are sending candidates. The Southern Reach has pledged 3. And Lucien, is he treating this like a coronation event or a hunting party? Aldrich paused. That pause told Raylor everything. The prince is enthusiastic, Your Majesty. He has commissioned new banners. There is talk of importing performers from the Ashenmere coast. Performers. Raylor's jaw tightened. He is choosing a Luna, a partner who will one day help him govern an empire that stretches from the Thornwall to the Glass Sea, and he wants performers. He is young, sire. He is 24. I was 24 when I held the Eastern Front against 40,000 Northland wolves with 600 men in a river that was freezing over. Raylor finally turned from the window. His eyes, iron gray, sharp enough to cut, found Aldrich's face. Being young is not a strategy. It is an excuse people grant you until the day they stop. Aldrich said nothing. He had perfected the art of absorptive silence decades ago. Leave the decree on my desk. I will review it before the scribes touch it. Yes, Your Majesty. The steward retreated and the door closed with the soft finality of a coffin lid. Raylor moved to the desk, but he did not sit. He stood over it, palms flat against the wood, staring at the map of Aurelion spread beneath a scatter of diplomatic correspondence and unsigned treaties. His kingdom. Every ridge, every river, every choke point. He had walked them, fought on them, bled into the dirt of them. And it was not enough. It was never enough, because the one thing he wanted most was not a territory he could conquer. He thought of her the way a man thinks of a wound he refuses to let heal, deliberately, painfully, with the full knowledge that the remembering was its own kind of self-destruction. Seraphine Vale, the healer's daughter, 23 years old, hair the color of dark copper, a mouth that curved downward when she was thinking and upward when she was pretending everything was fine. He had memorized both expressions the way a general memorizes the layout of a battlefield he knows he will eventually have to cross. She had been raised inside these walls. Her mother, Marin Vale, had served as the palace healer for 2 decades before a winter fever took her 7 years ago. After that, Seraphine had stayed. Not because anyone formally assigned her a role, but because the palace was the only home she knew, and because she had inherited her mother's gift for mending what others had broken. Raylor pressed his knuckles against his closed eyes and exhaled through his teeth. He had watched her grow up, not closely, not in a way that anyone would notice, but with the peripheral awareness of a man who understood that some things became more dangerous the longer you looked at them directly. She had been a child when he first took the throne. She was not a child anymore. And she was in love with his son. That particular truth sat in his chest like a swallowed blade, and no amount of strategic thinking could dislodge it. The tournament would begin in 9 days. He had 9 days to watch her fight for the right to stand beside Lucian. 9 days to sit on his throne and observe while the woman who haunted every unguarded corner of his mind tried to earn a crown by pledging herself to another man. Raylor opened his eyes, straightened his spine, and began reading the tournament decree. Survival was not about avoiding pain. It was about deciding which pain you were willing to carry and for how long. He had been carrying this one for years. The healer's quarters occupied a narrow set of rooms on the ground floor of the western wing, pressed between the herb gardens and the servants' corridor. It smelled of dried lavender and something sharper, yarrow, maybe, or the astringent tincture Seraphine brewed for burns. She was not sleeping. She had not slept properly in 3 nights. Not since the decree was first whispered through the kitchen staff and the laundry women and the stable hands. The invisible network that knew everything in Aurelion before any scribe set ink to parchment. A tournament for Lucien's Luna. Seraphine sat on the edge of her narrow cot, her hands clasped between her knees, her copper hair loose and tangled from hours of restless turning. The candle on her bedside table had burned to a stub. She watched it flicker and thought about the mathematics of wanting something you had no right to want. She was not noble. She held no land, commanded no soldiers, carried no bloodline that any herald would recognize. She was the healer's daughter, the girl who mixed poultices and stitched wounds, and knew the names of every bone in the human body, but not the name of a single dance performed at a royal ball. And she loved Lucien. She had loved him since she was 14 and he was 15, and he had shown up at her mother's door with a dislocated shoulder from a sparring accident, grinning through the pain like it was the funniest thing that had ever happened to him. She had set the joint, her mother guiding her hands, talking her through it. And when the bone slid back into place, Lucien had looked at her with those warm golden eyes and said, "You have steadier hands than any soldier I have ever met." 9 years. She had loved him for 9 years without once saying it out loud, because saying it would make it real, and real things could be rejected, and rejection from Lucien would not just break her heart, it would erase the only version of herself she had ever believed in. The candle guttered and went out, leaving her in the dark. Tomorrow, the decree would be official. The tournament would begin, and every noble daughter with ambition and a pulse would descend upon Aurelion like wolves scenting blood. Seraphine stood. She moved to the small window and pushed it open. The night air hit her face, cool, carrying the scent of rain and distant wood smoke. She was not going to wait. She was not going to sit in this room and watch from behind a window while the future she wanted walked away from her because she had been too afraid to reach for it. She would tell him. Before the tournament, before the candidates arrived, before the machinery of politics and power ground everything into dust. She would go to the royal wing, find Lucien's chambers, and she would speak. The decision sat in her stomach like a stone, heavy, immovable, and strangely steadying. She pulled on a plain linen dress, tied her hair back with a leather cord, and slipped into the corridor. The royal wing at night was a different world. The wide corridors were lit by crystal sconces that threw fractured light across marble floors. Every surface gleamed, every shadow had weight. Seraphine moved through it with the careful steps of someone acutely aware that she did not belong. She had been in the royal wing before, delivering medicines, treating minor injuries among the guard, once helping a lady-in-waiting through a difficult labor, but always in daylight, always with purpose sanctioned by someone above her station. This was different. This was her own will carrying her forward, and her own will had never felt so fragile. She passed 2 guard stations. The first pair barely glanced at her. She was a familiar face, the healer's girl, harmless. The second pair exchanged a look but said nothing. Palace staff moved through these halls at all hours. It was unusual, but not alarming. Lucien's chambers were on the third floor, east side. She had delivered a tonic there once, 2 years ago, when he had a chest cold that would not break. She remembered the corridor, wide, with a tapestry depicting the Battle of Ashen Ridge. She turned the corner and saw the tapestry. Relief flooded through her. The door was ahead, heavy oak with iron fittings. But the corridor branched, left toward the east-facing rooms, right toward... She hesitated. The doors were identical. Same oak, same iron, same ancient stonework framing each entrance like the mouth of something waiting. She chose right. Her knuckles rapped against the wood before her courage could fail. 3 quick knocks. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her wrists, her throat, the backs of her knees. No answer. She knocked again, harder. A sound from within. Movement. Heavy. Deliberate. The door swung open, and every prepared word evaporated from her mind like water on a forge. It was not Lucien. The man standing in the doorway was taller by half a head, broader by a margin that made the frame seem inadequate, and radiating a kind of controlled danger that turned the air in the corridor into something she had to force into her lungs. His chest was bare, crisscrossed with scars she recognized from a medical standpoint, and feared from every other. His eyes, iron gray, cold enough to sting, locked onto her face with an intensity that stopped her mid-breath. King Raylor Voss, Alpha of Aurelian. And he was staring at her like he had been expecting her and dreading her arrival in equal measure. She started. "You are in the wrong corridor," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, and utterly devoid of warmth. Not cruel, just stripped of anything unnecessary. "I was looking for... The prince's quarters are east. You turned west." He did not step back, did not invite her in, did not do any of the things a reasonable person would do when confronted with a lost woman in their doorway at midnight. He simply stood there, filling the space, watching her with those unreadable eyes. Seraphine's face burned. She could feel the flush climbing from her chest to her neck to her cheeks, and there was not a single thing she could do to stop it. "Forgive me, Your Majesty, I did not mean to disturb. What business does a healer have with the Crown Prince at this hour?" The question was a blade wrapped in silk, polite enough to pass for civil, sharp enough to draw blood. She lifted her chin. It was a reflex, the same reflex that made her steady her hands before setting a broken bone, the same reflex that kept her voice even when a patient was screaming. "Personal business, Your Majesty." Something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker. Not anger. Not amusement. Something older and more complicated than either. "Personal business," he repeated, as though tasting the words and finding them bitter. "Yes." "With my son?" "Yes." A silence stretched between them. The kind of silence that has teeth. The kind that bites down and does not let go until one person breaks. Raylor broke it, not with words, with movement. He stepped back just enough to no longer block the doorway and tilted his head toward the interior of his chambers. "Come in." "Your Majesty, You should, but you are already here, and whatever you are about to do in my son's rooms at midnight will go considerably worse if you do it in the state you are currently in." His gaze swept over her, not leering, not predatory, but clinical. The assessment of a man who had spent decades reading people the way other men read maps. "You are shaking. Your pulse is visible in your throat, and the speech you have prepared is sitting behind your teeth like a mouthful of broken glass." Seraphine stared at him. "How do you—" "Because I have watched men walk into battles they were not ready for. The expression is always the same." He turned and walked into the room, leaving the door open behind him. 5 minutes. Then you go where you intended to go." She should have left. Every rational instinct told her to back away, return to the correct corridor, knock on the correct door, and deliver the confession she had been rehearsing for 3 days. But there was something in his voice that snagged her, not kindness. Raylor Voss did not traffic in kindness, something more useful. Honesty. The blunt, unvarnished honesty of a man who had no reason to lie to her because she was too far beneath him for deception to be worth the effort. Seraphine stepped through the door. The king's private chambers were not what she expected. No gilded furniture, no silk drapes, no visible luxury. The room was large but sparse. A desk buried under documents, a weapons rack against the far wall holding 3 swords, and a war axe with a notched blade, a bed that was military neat, and bookshelves lining every remaining surface. It looked like the quarters of a general who had simply forgotten to move out after the war ended. Raylor poured water from a clay pitcher into a plain cup and set it on the desk. He did not offer it to her. He simply placed it within reach and sat in the chair opposite, folding his arms across his scarred chest. "Speak," he said. "I'm going to tell Lucien how I feel." "Before the tournament?" "Yes. Because you believe that if you speak first, before the machinery begins, your words will carry weight they would not carry once the competition is underway." She blinked. "Yes, exactly." Raylor studied her for a long moment. His jaw worked beneath the skin, a subtle grinding motion, like a man chewing on something he did not want to swallow. "And what do you expect him to say?" "I do not know." "Lie." The word cracked through the room like a whip. Seraphine flinched. "You know exactly what you expect him to say," Raylor continued, his voice dropping to something quieter and more dangerous. "You expect him to be surprised, then moved, then to take your hands and tell you he has always cared for you, and that the tournament is just a formality, and that you were the one he wanted before any of this began." His eyes held hers. "That is the version you have been playing in your head for 3 days." She wanted to deny it. She could not. "What you have not played," Raylor said, "is the version where he says nothing, where he looks at you with pity instead of love, where he tells you that you are dear to him, like a sister, like a friend, like something precious but ultimately not enough, and that the tournament must proceed as planned because the kingdom requires an alliance, not a love story." Each word landed like a hammer on cold metal. Precise, merciless, true. "You do not know that is what he will say," Seraphine managed. Her voice was steady, but only because she was clenching her jaw hard enough to ache. "No, I do not. But I know my son." Raylor leaned back in his chair. "Lucien is good, genuinely good, in a way that most people in this palace have forgotten is possible. And genuinely good men are the worst possible people to confess to, because they will break your heart gently. They will make you feel grateful for the kindness of the knife." The water sat untouched on the desk between them. Seraphine's hands had stopped shaking. That surprised her. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you walked into the wrong room, and I am not a man who wastes an accident." He unfolded his arms and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. This close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, the small scar bisecting his left eyebrow. He looked less like a king and more like a man who had been awake too long. "You want to stand in front of Lucien and be heard. Fine, but you will not be heard if you walk in there trembling and hopeful and naked in every way that matters. The court will eat you alive. The candidates will eat you alive. And Lucien, whatever he feels, will not be able to protect you from what happens next. I'm not asking for protection. No, you are asking for a miracle, and miracles are the currency of the desperate." He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the stone floor. You want a chance? A real one? Then stop thinking like a woman in love and start thinking like a woman at war." "I am not at war." "You entered a tournament for the Crown Princess Luna. You are at war with every noble daughter, every political alliance, and every expectation this kingdom has built over 1,000 years." He crossed to the weapons rack and pulled down a practice sword, wooden, weighted, the kind used to train children. He held it out to her. "Can you fight?" "I am a healer." "That is not what I asked." Seraphine looked at the sword, then at the king, then back at the sword. Something was happening that she did not fully understand. The ground beneath her feet was shifting, and the path she had planned, the simple, terrifying, beautiful path of walking to Lucien's door and speaking her truth, was branching into something far more complicated. "I have never held a sword," she said. "Then you will lose the first trial in the first hour, and the confession you came here to deliver will not matter, because you will be escorted from the tournament grounds before Lucien finishes his morning tea." Raylor's arm did not waver. The wooden sword hung between them like a question that would not go away. The tournament is not a dance. It is combat, wilderness survival, political strategy, and public performance. Every candidate will have trained for years. You have trained for none of it. Then why offer? Because you walk through my door. His voice was quiet now, almost gentle, though the word did not fit him properly, like armor strapped onto a body it was not made for. And because I have spent 17 years watching people enter fights they cannot win, most of them die. A few of them survive. The difference is never strength. It is never speed. It is never bloodline or breeding or the quality of their steel. He pushed the sword closer. The difference is whether someone told them the truth before the first blow landed. Seraphine reached out and wrapped her fingers around the wooden hilt. It was heavier than she expected. The grain was rough against her palm, and the weight of it pulled at her wrist in a way that made her aware of muscles she had never used. 5 minutes are up, she said. They have been up for 10. She looked at him, really looked, for the first time since she had entered the room. Not at the king, not at the title, at the man beneath. He was watching her with an expression she could not name, something caught between resignation and a hunger so carefully controlled that it barely registered on his face. His hands were at his sides. His breathing was even, but his eyes, those iron-gray battlefield eyes, were not calm. They were burning. She did not understand it. Not yet. When do we start? She asked. Raylor's jaw tightened. He turned away from her, moved to the window, and stared out at the darkness beyond. Tomorrow, before dawn. The Eastern Training Yard. Tell no one. Why no one? Because the king training a commoner for his own son's tournament is not strategy. It is scandal, and scandal in this palace does not wound, it kills. Seraphine nodded. She set the wooden sword on the desk beside the untouched water, turned, and walked to the door. Her hand was on the iron handle when his voice stopped her. Seraphine. She turned. He was still facing the window, his back to her, the moonlight cutting across his shoulders like a blade. If you are going to do this, if you are going to step into that arena and fight for what you want, then you need to understand one thing before anything else. What? The tournament will test everything you are. Your body, your mind, your will, your loyalty. He paused. The muscles across his back shifted, tightening as if he were bracing against something only he could see. But the most dangerous test will not come from any trial or any rival. Then where? He did not answer for a long time. The silence was thick enough to touch. Go, before the guards change rotation. She went, and as she moved through the dark corridor, past the tapestry, past the branching hallways, past the doors that all looked the same in the dark, she realized something that unsettled her more than the confession she had failed to deliver. She was not thinking about Lucien. She was thinking about the way the king's voice had cracked, almost imperceptibly, on the word loyalty. Dawn. Dawn came gray and cold, the kind of morning that made the palace stones sweat and turned the training yard into a field of damp earth and low-hanging mist. Seraphine arrived before the sun crested the eastern wall, dressed in borrowed trousers and a tunic she had taken from the servant's supply. Her hair was tied back. Her hands were empty. Raylor was already there. He stood in the center of the yard, dressed in plain black. No crown, no insignia, no indication that the man stretching his shoulders in the gray light ruled everything visible from the highest tower. He looked smaller without the trappings. Not physically. He was still broad enough to cast a shadow that could swallow hers. But the absence of regalia stripped away something. A layer. A performance. You came, he said. You told me to. I told a great many people to do a great many things. Most of them find reasons not to. He tossed her a wooden sword. She caught it clumsily, the hilt smacking against her palm hard enough to sting. First rule. A weapon is not a tool. It is an extension of your intent. If your intent is uncertain, the weapon is useless. My intent is clear. Your intent is to win a man who has never once looked at you the way you want him to. Raylor circled her slowly, his steps measured, predatory, without effort. That is not intent. That is longing wearing a mask. We need to burn the mask off before it gets you killed. The first lesson lasted 2 hours. He taught her stance, grip, footwork, the basics that any noble child learned at age 8. He did not soften the instruction. He did not encourage. When she dropped the sword, he waited in silence until she picked it up. When she stumbled, he did not offer a hand. When she swung and missed the training post by a full arm's length, he said, "Again," and nothing else. By the time the mist lifted and the first kitchen staff began crossing the far courtyard, Seraphine's arms burned from shoulder to fingertip. Her palms were raw. Her legs trembled from holding stances that her body was not built for. And she had never felt more awake in her entire life. "Enough," Raylor said. He pulled the sword from her grip, not roughly, but with the casual authority of a man reclaiming something that belonged to him. "You will be useless in the first trial, possibly the second, but you learn quickly, and your balance is better than I expected." Is that a compliment? It is an observation. Compliments are for people who need encouragement. You need accuracy. He sheathed the practice sword in a rack bolted to the yard wall. "Same time tomorrow. Bring water. I will not remind you again." Seraphine stood in the empty training yard, chest heaving, sweat cooling on her skin despite the chill. The sun was rising now, turning the stone walls gold and amber, and somewhere in the palace above her, servants were lighting fires and laying breakfast tables and carrying fresh linens to rooms she would never occupy. She looked down at her hands. The skin across both palms was angry red, already beginning to blister where the wooden hilt had ground against flesh unaccustomed to friction. These were healer's hands, hands trained to be gentle, hands that knew the precise pressure needed to set a fracture without causing additional damage, the exact angle to suture a wound so the scar would lie flat. Now they were raw, torn at the edges, beginning to callous in places that would change the way she held everything else. She closed her fists. Good. 3 days into the training, something shifted. Seraphine could not have named it if pressed. It was not a single moment, but a slow accumulation, like sediment building at the bottom of a river, until the current itself began to change. Raylor did not train her like a student. He trained her like an opponent. Every drill was a confrontation. Every correction carried the weight of consequence. Your guard drops when you are tired. Fix it, or someone will put a blade through your ribs and you will die wondering why you did not listen. Your footwork is predictable. 3 steps left, pivot, strike. I have seen it 4 times. The 5th time, I will counter and you will land on your back. Stop apologizing when you miss. Apology is a reflex bred into people who have been taught that their existence is an inconvenience. You are not an inconvenience. You are a combatant. Act like it. That last one caught her. She was mid-swing, the wooden blade arcing toward a target she had missed twice already, and his words hit her harder than any physical blow could have. She stopped, lowered the sword, looked at him. "Say that again." "Which part?" "The part about apology." Raylor's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted, like a door opening in a room she had not known existed. Apology is a survival mechanism for people who grew up believing they take up too much space. You apologize when you miss because somewhere, a long time ago, someone taught you that your failures were burdens on other people. He stepped closer, not threatening, just close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat, steady and strong. That lesson was wrong. Unlearn it. Quickly. She swung again. She hit the target. Neither of them mentioned it. But that night, lying in her narrow cot with aching muscles and blistered hands, Seraphine replayed his words and felt something loosen in her chest. A knot she had carried so long she had forgotten it was there. Apology is a survival mechanism for people who grew up believing they take up too much space. No one had ever said that to her. No one had ever identified the invisible weight she carried. The constant reflexive shrinking, the habit of making herself smaller so that the world around her would not notice how much room she actually needed. Raylor had seen it, not because he was kind, because he was precise. And precision, she was beginning to understand, was its own form of mercy. On the 5th morning, Lucien appeared at the training yard. Not deliberately. He was cutting through to the stables, flanked by two attendants and wearing the easy golden boy smile that had made half the palace fall in love with him before his voice had finished changing. He moved like someone who had never once questioned whether the ground beneath his feet would hold. Seraphine? She froze. She was mid-drill, the wooden sword extended, her weight on her front foot, sweat plastering loose strands of hair to her temples. Lucien, she lowered the sword. Good morning. He approached, curiosity brightening his already bright face. Since when do you train? I did not know you had any interest in... He gestured at the sword, the yard, her sweat-soaked tunic. This. Since recently. For the tournament? His eyebrows rose, not mocking, genuinely surprised. Seraphine, you know the tournament is designed for candidates. I know. She met his gaze and held it. I am entering. The silence that followed was not the cruel, weighted silence of the king's chambers. It was something softer, more confused. Lucien tilted his head, and for a moment he looked exactly like the 15-year-old boy who had grinned through a dislocated shoulder. You are serious. Completely. He studied her, her stance, her grip on the sword, the new calluses on her hands. Something shifted in his expression. Not recognition, not love, but a faint, dawning awareness that the girl he had known his entire life was standing in front of him wearing a shape he did not recognize. Then I wish you well. He smiled. Warm, genuine, insufficient. Truly, Seraphine, I hope the trials treat you fairly. He moved on toward the stables. His attendants followed. The sound of his boots on the cobblestones faded into the morning. Seraphine stood in the training yard, wooden sword in hand, and felt the exact weight of every word he had not said. I wish you well. Not I want you there. Not I have been hoping. Not I have been waiting. I wish you well. The language of distance dressed up as warmth. She raised the sword and swung at the target so hard the impact cracked the post. Better, said a voice from the shadows beneath the eastern archway. She turned. Raylor stood in the darkness where the wall met the corridor entrance, arms folded, expression unreadable. She had not heard him arrive. She had no idea how long he had been watching. How much did you hear? She asked. Enough. And? He stepped into the light. The dawn caught his face, sharpening the angles, deepening the lines. He looked at her the way a man looks at a fire he has been told not to touch, fully aware of the warmth and fully aware of the cost. The tournament begins in 4 days, he said. We have work to do. He walked past her, close enough that she caught his scent, steel, leather, something wood smoke dark underneath, and took up position beside the training post. Again, what? He said. She swung, and somewhere deep beneath the surface of everything she thought she understood, a crack began to form, thin as a hairline, quiet as a breath held too long, in the wall she had built around the word love. She did not notice it yet, but Raylor did. He noticed everything about her. That was the whole goddamn problem. But the morning of the 6th day, Seraphine arrived at the training yard to find it empty. No Raylor, no practice swords laid out, no water pitcher resting on the stone bench. She waited. 10 minutes. 20. The sun crawled above the wall, turning the mist gold, and still no one came. Then she heard it. Voices from the upper gallery. Raised. Tense. One was Aldrich's measured baritone. The other was a woman's voice she did not recognize, lilting and deliberate and carrying the unmistakable cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Arrived with a full retinue. 16 attendants, an armored escort, and enough luggage to furnish a second palace. Aldrich's voice echoed down the stairwell. Lady Thessera Morvain, daughter of the Northern Duke, she is requesting an audience with the king. A pause. Then Raylor's voice, flat and hard. Requesting. Demanding would be more accurate, Your Majesty. Tell the Northern Duke's daughter that the king does not receive visitors before the tournament formally opens. Protocol exists for a reason. She has indicated that her visit is not related to the tournament. She carries a sealed proposal from her father regarding a potential royal union. The silence that followed was the kind that makes the air itself flinch. Seraphine pressed her back against the cold stone of the stairwell, invisible in the shadow, her heart hammering against her ribs. A royal union, not for Lucian. The language was wrong. A union with the king, with Raylor. "Receive her in the formal hall at midday," Raylor said finally. His voice was controlled, but changed, thinner, like a wire stretched past its tolerance. "Full protocol. No private audience." "Yes, Your Majesty." Footsteps above. Movement. Then silence. Seraphine stood in the stairwell with her back against the wall and her hands pressed flat against the stone, and a new understanding settling into her bones like cold water. The tournament was for Lucien, but Raylor was a prize too. An unmarried king, an alpha without a Luna, and every powerful house in every corner of the empire knew it. She should not have cared. This had nothing to do with her. Her fight was for Lucien. Her training was for Lucien. Her heart, battered, stubborn, relentless, belonged to Lucien. Then why did the thought of a woman from the northern reach standing in Raylor's formal hall, offering herself as his queen, make Seraphine's hands curl into fists so tight her cracked nails bit into her blistered palms? Why did it feel like losing something she had never been allowed to claim? She uncurled her fingers, looked down at the blood beading in the half-moon cuts across her palms. 4 days until the tournament. A northern noblewoman in the palace with a marriage proposal for the king. And a crack. Thin, quiet, devastating, splitting wider through everything Seraphine thought she knew about her own heart. The blood on her palms had dried by the time Seraphine made it back to the healer's quarters. She washed it off in the basin, watching the water turn pink, and pressed a strip of clean linen across the cuts. Her hands were steady. The rest of her was not. She had no right to feel what she was feeling. She knew that. Knew it the way you know the edge of a cliff is dangerous even when you cannot see the bottom. Raylor Voss was the king. He was not hers. He had never been hers. He had offered her training, not tenderness, and whatever lived behind those iron-gray eyes when he looked at her was his burden to carry, not hers to name. And yet. The knock at her door came just past midday. She expected a servant. She got Lucien. He stood in the narrow corridor outside her quarters, dressed in tournament finery. A deep blue coat stitched with silver thread, his golden hair brushed back, looking every inch the prince the kingdom wanted him to be. He smelled like cedar oil and something sweet, probably the imported cologne his attendants pressed on him before public appearances. "Seraphine, do you have a moment?" "Of course." He stepped inside and immediately looked uncomfortable. The room was small, too small for someone who had spent his entire life in chambers designed to remind him of his own importance. He glanced at the herb bundles hanging from the ceiling, the narrow cot, the shelves lined with tincture bottles and surgical tools. "I wanted to speak with you about the tournament." "What about it?" "The candidate list was finalized this morning. Your name is on it." He paused. Not for dramatic effect. Lucien did not operate that way. He paused because the next words cost him something. "Several members of the court have raised objections." "On what grounds?" "Bloodline, station, the usual arguments." "And what did you say?" Lucien met her eyes. His were warm, the color of late afternoon sun through amber glass, and filled with the particular brand of discomfort that belonged to good men delivering difficult truths. "I said that the tournament rules do not specify noble birth as a requirement, which is true. My father wrote those rules himself 20 years ago, and he was deliberate about what he included and what he left out. So I am permitted to compete." "You are." "But, Seraphine, He took a step closer, then stopped, as if the proximity itself was a statement he was not ready to make. "The women entering this tournament have been trained since childhood. Lady Thessara Morvain alone has won 3 regional combat championships. The Ashenmere twins have political connections that stretch across 4 kingdoms. You are walking into a room full of people who have spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this." "I know." "Do you?" "Because what I saw in the training yard, and I mean no disrespect, was someone who picked up a sword for the first time a week ago." The words should have stung. They did not. And the reason they did not was something Seraphine could not yet fully articulate, except that somewhere between the first blistered palm and the cracked training post, She had stopped measuring herself against other people's expectations. "Lucienne, why are you here?" He blinked. "What do you mean? You could have sent a messenger. You could have posted the candidate list on the Great Hall doors and let me find my own name. You walked down 3 flights of stairs to the servants' wing to tell me personally that I am allowed to compete in your tournament. Why?" The silence that followed was not the silence of the king's chambers. Dense, pressurized, loaded with decades of unspoken weight. This was lighter, more fragile, the silence of a man standing at the edge of something he did not quite understand. "Because you are my friend," Lucian said finally, "and I did not want you to hear it from someone who does not care about you." Friend. There it was, the word that built walls while pretending to open doors. "Thank you," Seraphine said. Her voice was even. Her face was still. Inside, something shifted. Not broke, not shattered, but shifted. The way a bone moves when it is healing crooked, and the body quietly decides to reroute the load to something stronger. "I should go. The reception for the northern delegation begins within the hour." Lucienne turned toward the door, then stopped. "Seraphine." "Yes?" "Be careful, please." He left. The door closed softly behind him. Seraphine stood in her small room, surrounded by the smell of dried herbs and old linen, and realized that the word friend had not destroyed her. It had freed her. Not completely. Not cleanly. But enough to feel the difference between the woman who had knocked on the wrong door 6 nights ago and the woman standing here now with calloused palms and a jaw that had learned how to set itself against incoming blows. She pulled the linen from her hands, flexed her fingers, and went to find the king. The formal reception hall was a cathedral of polished stone and banners, built to remind visiting dignitaries that Aurelian did not negotiate from weakness. Seraphine did not enter through the main doors. She was not stupid enough to walk into a political event uninvited. She used the servants' passage behind the Eastern tapestry, the one the kitchen staff used to deliver wine during state dinners, and positioned herself in the narrow gallery above the hall where the light was poor and the sightlines were excellent. Lady Thessera Morvain stood at the center of the room like she had been built specifically to occupy that space. Tall, sharp-featured, black hair cut short in the northern military style, emphasizing a jawline that could have been carved from the same stone as the hall itself. She wore armor, not ceremonial, not decorative, but actual battle-scarred plate over dark leather, as if she had ridden straight from a campaign into a king's court without bothering to change. She was beautiful the way a blade is beautiful, functional, dangerous, and utterly indifferent to whether you admired it. Raylor sat on the raised dais at the far end of the hall, not the throne, the formal chair reserved for political audiences, positioned slightly lower to convey accessibility without sacrificing authority. His face was stone. His hands rested on the arms of the chair, fingers loose, posture deliberately open. Every detail controlled, every signal calibrated. "Your Majesty," the Tsar's voice carried through the hall with the clarity of someone who had been trained to project across battlefields. She did not bow. She inclined her head, the greeting of an equal, not a subordinate. "My father sends his regards and his gratitude for receiving me." Duke Morvain's courtesy is noted. Raylor's voice matched hers, clear, controlled, revealing nothing. "I trust the journey was uneventful. 3 days through the Thornwall Pass in late autumn. Nothing is uneventful." A faint smile touched her mouth. Not warm, strategic. "But we are accustomed to difficult terrain in the north. I am aware. Your family has held the northern border for 4 generations. It is one of the few things in this kingdom I have never had cause to worry about." Thessera's smile sharpened. The compliment had landed exactly where she intended it to, and she knew he knew it. "My father believes the border deserves more than a garrison and a title. He believes it deserves a permanent alliance." The proposal. The proposal. She reached into the leather satchel at her hip and produced a sealed document, which she handed to Aldrich, who had materialized beside the dais with the practiced invisibility of a man who had spent 40 years becoming furniture. The terms are straightforward: a marriage between the Northern Duchy and the Crown of Aurelian, shared military command of the Thornwall Defense Corridor, trade concessions on the mineral routes, and an heir within 3 years to formalize the union. Raylor did not reach for the document. He did not look at it. He looked at Thesara. "And what do you want?" The question caught her. Barely. A fractional pause, a slight narrowing of the eyes. But Seraphine, watching from above, saw it. The first crack in a very well-built wall. "I want what my father wants. Stability. Security. A partnership that serves. I asked what you want, not your father, not the duchy, you." Thesara held his gaze. The hall was silent except for the faint crackle of the wall torches and the distant sound of horses in the courtyard. "I want to matter," she said, "not as a symbol, not as a treaty clause, as a force that shapes the future of this empire." She lifted her chin. "I did not ride 3 days through a mountain pass to be decorative." Raylor studied her for a long moment. Then he stood. The movement was slow, deliberate, the uncoiling of something that had been still for too long. He descended from the dais, crossed the stone floor, and stopped an arm's length from Thesara. This close, the difference between them was stark. He was broader, heavier, scarred in ways that spoke of campaigns she had only read about. But she did not shrink. She met his eyes without blinking, and in the gallery above, Seraphine's fingers tightened on the stone railing until her knuckles went white. "Your honesty is noted, Lady Morvain." His voice was quiet enough now that only Thesara and the nearest guards could hear. "The proposal will be reviewed. No decision will be made before the tournament concludes. The tournament is for the crown prince. The tournament is for the kingdom. Everything in this palace is for the kingdom." He turned and walked back toward the dais. "Aldrich will arrange quarters for your delegation. I trust the Eastern Wing is acceptable." "The Eastern Wing will do." "Good." The audience was over. Thesara inclined her head again, that same not-quite bow, and turned on her heel, her armored boots striking the stone floor with the measured cadence of a woman who understood that leaving a room well was as important as entering it. Raylor watched her go. Then his gaze lifted, slowly, inevitably, as if pulled by something stronger than his considerable will, to the gallery above. He saw Seraphine. She knew he saw her because his expression did not change, not a flicker, not a twitch. But his hands, resting at his sides, curled into fists so tight she could see the tendons standing out across his forearms, even from 20 feet above. She held his gaze for 3 heartbeats. Then she stepped back from the railing and disappeared into the servants' passage. He found her in the training yard at dusk. She was swinging at the cracked post with the wooden sword, her form still imperfect but improving. Her feet were wider now, her weight lower, her strikes landing with intention rather than hope. "You were in the gallery." It was not a question. "Yes." She did not stop swinging. Strike, reset, strike. The rhythm was becoming automatic, which meant her body was learning even when her mind was elsewhere. "Why?" "Because I wanted to see her. And she is everything I am not." Strike. The post shuddered. Noble, trained, political. She walked into that room like she owned half the kingdom and was coming to collect the rest. She walked into that room like a woman delivering a transaction. There is a difference between commanding a space and purchasing one. Raylor moved to the weapons rack and pulled down 2 practice swords. He tossed one to her. She caught it cleanly this time, no fumble, no sting, and took up position opposite. "We spar tonight. I am not ready." "You will never be ready. That is the point. The tournament does not wait for readiness. It arrives, and you either meet it or you do not." He raised his sword. "Guard up!" She raised hers. Their wooden blades crossed in the fading light, with a sound like dry branches cracking. He came at her with controlled strikes. Not full force, but not gentle either. Each one tested a specific element: her guard, her footwork, her reaction time, her willingness to hold ground when every instinct screamed to retreat. She blocked the first, deflected the second, missed the third entirely, and took a stinging blow across her left shoulder that would leave a bruise shaped like a half moon. "You dropped your guard. You hit me. You let me." He reset, raised the sword. "Again." They sparred until the yard was dark and the torches along the corridor walls became the only source of light. Seraphine's body ached in places she did not know could ache. Her breathing was ragged, her tunic soaked through, her hair plastered to her temples. But she was still standing, and on the last exchange, a clumsy, desperate, instinct-driven lunge that had no business working, the tip of her wooden sword caught Raylor across the ribs. He stopped, looked down at the point of contact, looked up at her. Something passed between them that was not about combat. It was not about training or readiness or tournaments or the Northern Duke's daughter with her armor and her marriage proposal and her refusal to bow. It was older than any of those things and more dangerous than all of them combined. "Good," he said. The word was rough, scraped out of him like something he had not intended to release. "Do that again in 3 days and you might survive the first trial." He turned and walked away. His footsteps echoed across the empty yard, steady and even, betraying nothing. But Seraphine had spent years reading bodies, while the tremor in a hand that signaled a fracture, the hitch in a breath that warned of a collapsed lung, the subtle shift in posture that revealed pain a patient was trying to hide. And she had seen the way Raylor's hand trembled when she touched him, not from the impact, not from exertion, from the effort of not reaching back. She stood in the dark yard, chest heaving, a bruise blooming on her shoulder, and the ghost of contact still humming through the wooden blade in her hand, and understood for the first time that the crack in her wall was not a crack. It was a door, and someone on the other side had been waiting to see if she would open it. The morning of the tournament registration, Seraphine walked into the great hall. The room was already crowded. Noble daughters flanked by attendants, foreign candidates with interpreters, representatives from houses whose names she had only heard whispered in corridors she was not supposed to occupy. The noise was dense, layered, competitive. Every woman in the room was measuring every other woman in the room, calculating odds, identifying weaknesses, building alliances, and selecting targets. Seraphine wore her borrowed trousers and a clean tunic, no attendants, no insignia, no house name to announce. Lady Thessara Morvain stood near the front of the hall, arms crossed, flanked by 2 northern guards in black steel. She saw Seraphine immediately. The assessment took less than 3 seconds, eyes moving from face to clothes to hands to posture, and arriving at a conclusion that she did not bother to hide. Dismissal. Seraphine walked to the registration table. The herald, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and the permanent squint of someone who had spent too many years reading by candlelight, looked up at her. Name? Seraphine Vale. House? None. The herald's quill paused above the parchment. He glanced at the steward beside him. The steward glanced at the guards. A small, uncomfortable ripple spread outward from the registration table like a stone dropped in still water. "The tournament is open to all women of the kingdom," Seraphine said. Her voice carried further than she intended. "Those are the rules, written by the king himself." The herald dipped his quill and wrote her name. Behind her, the hall had gone quiet. Not silent. The noise was still there. The whispers, the shifting of bodies, and the rustle of silk, but quiet in the way that a room gets when the people inside it have collectively decided to pay attention to something unexpected. Seraphine turned from the table and walked back through the hall. She did not look at Thessara. She did not look at any of them. She looked up. The royal balcony overlooked the great hall from the northern wall, a wide stone platform draped with the king's banner, iron gray and black, the colors of Aurelion's founding house. Raylor stood at the railing, hands clasped behind his back, his face as unreadable as the day she first stumbled through his door. But his eyes were on her, only on her. And in them, beneath the iron, beneath the control, beneath the 17 years of kingship that had turned a man into a monument, she saw something that stopped her breath and restarted her pulse in the same instant. It was not pride, it was not approval, it was fear. The same fear she had seen in the eyes of soldiers being carried into her mother's healing room. The fear of men who understood that the wound they had taken was the kind that does not heal, the kind that changes the shape of everything that comes after, the kind that makes you realize the body you trusted to carry you through the world has already decided to let something in that you will never be able to cut out. Raylor Voss, Alpha of Aurelian, conqueror of 6 provinces, the man whose name alone had ended wars, was afraid. Not of Thessara, not of the tournament, not of the Northern Duke's proposal or the 14 noble houses or the weight of the crown on his head. Of her, of what she was becoming, of the fact that every morning he spent training her to fight for his son's heart, his own was being torn apart, quietly, methodically, with the same precision he had taught her to wield a blade. Seraphine held his gaze from the floor of the great hall. She did not look away. She did not shrink. She stood in a room full of women born to rule and held the eyes of the most powerful man in the kingdom and let him see exactly what she was. Not a healer's daughter, not a commoner playing at ambition. A woman standing on the edge of something that would either make her or destroy everything. Then the herald called the next name, and the moment broke. But the door was open now, and neither of them knew how to close it. The first trial began at dawn on the tournament's opening day, and it was not what anyone expected. No arena, no spectators, no banners or trumpets or the comfortable theater of controlled violence that the noble houses had prepared their daughters for. Instead, the 43 candidates were marched single file through the palace's eastern gate and into the Ashwood, 6,000 acres of old-growth forest that bordered the kingdom's interior, dense enough to swallow sound and dark enough at ground level to make midday feel like dusk. Aldrich read the rules from a raised platform at the forest's edge, his voice carrying across the assembled women with the dry precision of a man reading a death warrant he had not written. Each candidate would be released into the Ashwood at 10-minute intervals. Somewhere inside, hidden among the ancient trees, 17 markers had been placed, iron discs stamped with the royal seal, each one buried or concealed in locations that tested tracking, endurance, and the willingness to keep moving when the body demanded rest. Every candidate who returned with fewer than 3 markers before sunset would be eliminated. No weapons, no provisions, no allies. Seraphine was the 31st candidate released. By the time she passed the tree line and the canopy closed overhead, the morning light had already thinned to a gray wash that turned every trunk into a shadow and every shadow into a question. She moved quickly. Not running. Raylor had beaten that impulse out of her in the training yard on the 4th morning. Running burned energy you could not replace and generated noise that announced your position to every competitor within earshot. She walked with purpose, keeping her footfalls on moss and soft earth, avoiding the dry leaf cover that crackled like a warning system designed by the forest itself. Her body was different now. 9 days of training had not made her strong, not in the way that years of combat preparation had made women like Thessara Morvain strong, but it had made her aware of her center of gravity, aware of the way her weight shifted when she turned, aware of the sound her own breathing made, and how to quiet it when the situation demanded silence. Raylor had taught her that, along with 50 other small, brutal lessons delivered in a voice that never softened and never lied. Move like you belong in the space, not like you are visiting it, not like you are borrowing it. The moment you start moving like a guest in your own body, someone will treat you like one. The first marker took her 2 hours to find. It was buried beneath a cairn of river stones near a dry stream bed, covered in moss thick enough to make it invisible from more than 3 feet away. She dug it out with her bare hands, the iron cold and heavy in her palm, and tucked it into the inside pocket of her tunic. The second marker came faster. She found it wedged into the hollow of a fallen oak, concealed by a shelf of bracket fungus. A lucky sighting. The light had shifted just enough to catch the edge of the royal seal, a flash of worked metal in a world of organic decay. 2 markers. Hours of daylight left. She needed 1 more. That was when she heard it. The sound of someone crashing through the undergrowth to the north, moving fast and careless, and accompanied by a noise that took Seraphine a full 3 seconds to identify. Crying. Ragged, gasping crying. The kind that came from a body pushed past its physical limit and a mind that had followed it over the edge. She found the girl in a shallow ravine, slumped against a moss-covered boulder with her left ankle twisted at an angle that told Seraphine everything she needed to know before she even knelt down. Lady Cerise Ashworth, youngest daughter of the Western March commander, 16 years old, blonde hair matted with dirt and leaf litter, face streaked with tears and grime, hands shaking so badly she could not even grip the boulder for support. The ankle was not broken. Seraphine's fingers told her that within seconds, a severe sprain, the ligaments stretched past their tolerance but not torn, painful, debilitating, but not permanent. "Can you walk?" Cerise looked up at her with the stunned, glassy expression of someone who had expected to be alone with their pain. It hurts. I know it hurts. Can you walk?" "I do not know." Seraphine pulled the girl's boot off with careful, practiced hands. The ankle was already swelling, the skin mottled purple and hot to the touch. She tore a strip from the bottom of her own tunic and bound the joint tight. Not enough to cut circulation, but enough to provide the compression needed to keep the swelling from getting worse. "Lean on me. We need to get you to the forest edge." "The trial is over for you. Your ankle will not support the kind of movement you need. If you keep going, the sprain becomes a fracture, and a fracture in the ashwood with no supplies and no healer means you limp out tomorrow morning at best and get carried out in pieces at worst." Cerise stared at her. The tears had stopped, replaced by something harder and more afraid. "My father will... He expects me to." "Your father is not here. You are." Seraphine pulled the girl's arm across her shoulders and lifted. The weight was awkward but manageable. "We go now." They moved slowly, painfully, Seraphine bearing most of Cerise's weight across terrain that fought them every step. Roots snagged their feet, low branches caught their hair. The ground was uneven enough to make every stride a negotiation between balance and forward momentum. It took them 90 minutes to reach the forest's edge. 90 minutes during which Seraphine did not search for a third marker. 90 minutes during which the sun continued its slow, indifferent arc across the sky, burning away the time she needed. She delivered Cerise to the medical station at the tournament perimeter, where two healers she recognized from the palace infirmary took over with efficiency and a shared look that Seraphine understood immediately. They knew what she had done. They knew what it had cost. She turned back toward the forest. 2 markers. Hours gone. And the daylight was starting to yellow, the shadows lengthening, the temperature dropping as the sun began its descent toward the western ridge. She ran, not the controlled, purposeful movement Raylor had taught her. This was desperate. Lungs burning, calves screaming, branches whipping across her forearms hard enough to draw thin lines of blood. She covered ground with the reckless urgency of a woman who understood that mercy had a price and she was about to pay it. The third marker found her, not the other way around. She tripped over a root system near a deadfall and landed hard, her palms slamming into the earth, and felt something solid beneath the leaf litter. Iron, the royal seal. She clawed it out of the dirt and clutched it to her chest, breathing so hard her vision pulsed at the edges. 3 markers. She made it back to the tournament perimeter 17 minutes before sunset. Mud-caked, bleeding from a dozen small cuts, her tunic torn and sweat-soaked, the linen strip she had used to bind Cerise's ankle now missing from her hem and leaving her tunic ragged and uneven. 31 women had been released into the ashwood that morning. 19 returned with sufficient markers. Seraphine was the last. She placed her 3 markers on the judge's table and walked to the water station without looking at anyone. Her hands were shaking again, but not from fear this time. From the particular kind of exhaustion that hollowed out everything non-essential and left only the raw framework of who you were. She drank, she breathed, she pressed her forehead against the cool stone of the perimeter wall and closed her eyes. When she opened them, the Sarah Morvain was standing 3 feet away, leaning against the same wall, arms crossed, her northern armor replaced by field clothes that were barely dirty. She had returned with 7 markers. First back. Not a scratch on her. "You stopped for the Ashworth girl." It was not a question. "Yes." "That cost you 4 hours and nearly your place in the tournament." The Sarah's voice was not mocking, it was clinical. The voice of a woman cataloging tactical decisions the way a physician catalogs symptoms. "You understand that in a real conflict, that choice gets you killed." It was not a real conflict, it was a trial. Everything is a real conflict. The trial, the tournament, the court, the marriage. None of it is separate from the rest. Every choice you make in one arena follows you into the next. The Tsara pushed off the wall and stood straight. She was exactly Seraphine's height, which surprised them both. You are either very brave or very stupid. I have not decided which. Let me know when you figure it out. The Tsara's mouth twitched, not a smile, something that might have become one if she had allowed it. She walked away, her field boots silent on the stone, and Seraphine watched her go with the strange, uncomfortable awareness that the woman who should have been her enemy had just shown her more respect than Lucien had managed in 9 years of friendship. 3 trials in 5 days. The Ashwood. A political strategy simulation in the council chambers that lasted 14 hours and eliminated 8 more candidates. A formal court presentation where each remaining woman was required to address the assembled nobility and defend her vision for the future of the Luna's office. Seraphine survived all 3. Not by dominating, by adapting. She fought the way water fights stone, not through force, but through relentless patient presence. She found angles the other candidates overlooked. She asked questions the judges did not expect. She spoke in the court presentation with a directness that made the noble houses uncomfortable, and the palace staff, watching from doorways and corridors and servant passages, quietly, fiercely proud. And every morning, before dawn, she trained with the king. The sessions had changed. Not in structure. Raylor was still demanding, still precise, still incapable of offering praise that was not surgically attached to a correction. But the space between them had changed. The distance was smaller now, not physically but atmospherically. The air in the training yard carried a charge that had not been there before. The kind of tension that builds before a storm breaks and that everyone can feel but no one can point to. On the 5th night, after the final trial of the first week, Raylor summoned her to the library. She had been in the king's private library once before. A massive, vaulted room on the 3rd floor of the western tower, every wall lined with books and maps and manuscripts so old that the parchment crumbled if you breathed on it wrong. It smelled like aged leather and candle wax, and the particular musty sweetness of knowledge that had been accumulating in the same room for centuries. Raylor stood at the window, silhouetted against the moonlight, and when she entered, he did not turn around. "Close the door." She did. "You were impressive today." His voice was different. The command structure was still there. It would always be there, but beneath it was something frayed, exposed, like rope that had been bearing weight too long. The council simulation, the way you redirected House Varen's trade proposal into a labor equity argument. I have not seen a move like that since Aldrich dismantled the Eastern Coalition's tariff scheme 15 years ago. Aldrich is a better diplomat than I am. Aldrich is a better diplomat than everyone. That is not the point. He turned from the window and the moonlight caught his face in a way that stripped away the king and left the man. Tired. Raw. His jaw set in a line she had learned to read as the place where control met its limit. "The point is that you are winning. I have not won anything." "You are winning," he repeated. "And when you win, when you stand in that hall and the crown is placed and the bond is sealed, you will belong to him." The word belong hit her like a physical blow, not because of what it meant, but because of the way he said it, like a man pronouncing a sentence he had already accepted, like a verdict he had delivered against himself. Raylor. It was the first time she had used his name without the title. The sound of it in her own voice frightened her more than the Ashwood, more than the trials, more than the entire machinery of a tournament designed to test whether she deserved to exist in spaces that had never been built for someone like her. He closed his eyes. Just for a second. When he opened them, the iron was back, but underneath it she could see the fault lines spreading. "You should go." "No." "Seraphine, and you trained me. Every morning for 9 days you stood in that yard and taught me how to hold a sword and set my feet and take a blow without flinching. You told me to stop apologizing. You told me to stop shrinking. You told me that the most dangerous test would not come from any trial or any rival." She took a step closer, then another. "You never told me where it would come from." "Because I did not want you to know." "I know now." The silence between them was the loudest thing she had ever heard. It filled the library from floor to vaulted ceiling, pressing against the books and the maps and the ancient parchment. And in that silence, Raylor Voss looked at Seraphine Vale with an expression that contained everything he had spent years refusing to say. He moved first. One step. His hand rose and stopped an inch from her face, fingers trembling with the effort of not touching her. I did not train you for him. His voice was barely a whisper, broken in places he had not known could break. I told myself I did. Every morning I walked into that yard and told myself this was for Lucy. For the kingdom, for the future of the empire. But it was never for him. Her breath caught, her chest ached with the pressure of something expanding too fast for the space that held it. It was for you, he said. It was always for you. I wanted you to be strong enough to stand beside. He stopped. His hand dropped. The muscle in his jaw clenched so hard she could hear his teeth. It does not matter. It matters. It changes nothing. The tournament proceeds. The kingdom requires... Stop. The word came out harder than she intended. Sharper. She was shaking now, not from fear or exhaustion, but from the raw, unbearable weight of standing in front of a man who had just handed her the most terrifying truth she had ever received. Stop telling me what the kingdom requires. Stop hiding behind duty and protocol and the weight of a crown you never asked for. Tell me what you require. His eyes, iron gray, battlefield eyes, eyes that had watched empires rise and men die and borders shift like sand, locked onto hers with an intensity that burned through every defense she had ever built. You, he said, I require you. He kissed her, or she kissed him. Later, neither of them could say who moved first because the distance between them collapsed so completely that the question of who initiated became irrelevant. His mouth found hers in the moonlit library, and the kiss was not gentle. It was desperate and furious, and tasted like years of silence finally breaking open, and his hands, the hands that had held swords and signed treaties, and gripped the arms of a throne, cradled her face with a tenderness so at odds with everything he was that it nearly destroyed her. When they finally separated, breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, the world had rearranged itself into a shape neither of them recognized. This cannot happen, he said against her mouth. It already did. And then the door opened. Neither of them heard the footsteps. Neither of them heard the latch. The library was too deep in the tower, and the silence between them had been too absolute for sound to penetrate. Lady Thessera Morvain stood in the doorway. Behind her, 2 steps back, his golden eyes wide with something that was not anger and not betrayal, but something worse, something quieter, something that looked exactly like the slow, sickening recognition of a pattern he should have seen months ago, stood Crown Prince Lucien. Seraphine stepped back from Raylor as if the air between them had ignited. The king's hands dropped to his sides. His face hardened, fast, brutal, the walls slamming back into place with the practiced speed of a man who had spent decades learning to contain damage. But it was too late. Lucien stared at his father, then at Seraphine, then at the space between them where the air still carried the heat of everything that had just happened. The northern delegation needed your signature on the border amendment, Lucien said. His voice was perfectly steady, perfectly calm, the voice of a man who had just watched something shatter and was already deciding which pieces to pick up and which to leave on the floor. The Sara offered to escort me. We were told you would be in the library. Raylor said nothing. Lucien looked at Seraphine one more time. His expression held no rage, no accusation, just a vast, quiet disappointment that was worse than both because it came from a man who had genuinely believed, until this exact second, that the world was kinder than it actually was. He turned and walked away. The Sara lingered for a half-second longer. Her eyes moved from Raylor to Seraphine and back again, and in them Seraphine saw something she did not expect, not triumph, not satisfaction, but a cold, calculating recognition. The Northern Duke's daughter had just received the single most valuable piece of political intelligence in the kingdom, and she knew exactly what it was worth. The door closed. Seraphine stood in the library with the taste of Raylor still on her lips and the sound of Lucien's retreating footsteps echoing through the stone corridor and the absolute crystalline certainty that everything she had built, every trial she had survived, every marker she had clawed from the earth, every blow she had taken in the training yard, every version of herself she had fought to become, had just collapsed into rubble. Raylor stood at the window with his back to her, and his hands braced against the stone ledge and his head bowed between his shoulders, and he did not move, did not speak, did not breathe in any way she could detect. The most powerful man in the kingdom looked exactly like what he was. A man who had just lost the only war that ever mattered, and who had lost it not to an enemy but to himself. Seraphine did not sleep that night. She lay on her cot in the healer's quarters with her eyes open and her body still and her mind running through every possible version of what came next, and every version ended the same way, in ruins. By morning, the palace had changed. She could feel it the moment she stepped into the servants' corridor, the way you feel a shift in atmospheric pressure before a storm arrives. The air was tighter, the glances were longer. Two kitchen maids who had always greeted her by name looked through her as if she had become transparent, and a guard stationed at the western stairwell watched her pass with the particular attention of someone who had been told to watch. The Sara had moved fast, faster than Seraphine had imagined possible. The rumor had not erupted, it had been planted, carefully, strategically, seated in exactly the right ears at exactly the right volume. Not a shout, but a whisper, and whispers in a palace like Aurelion were more lethal than any blade because you could not see who held them, and you could not predict where they would cut. The healer's daughter and the king. Midnight meetings in the royal library. A tournament contestant being trained in secret by the man whose son she was supposed to be competing for. The words did not need to be explicit. The implication was a weapon that sharpened itself. Seraphine reached the training yard at dawn out of habit rather than hope. It was empty. No practice swords on the rack, no water pitcher on the stone bench, no king standing in the gray light waiting to tell her to fix her guard and stop apologizing for existing. She stood in the center of the yard for a long time, the morning cold pressing against her skin, and felt the particular kind of abandonment that comes not from being left, but from understanding exactly why someone had to leave. Raylor was protecting the crown, protecting Lucy Yen, protecting the institution that held the kingdom together. Every minute he spent near her now was a minute of ammunition delivered directly into Thessara Morvaine's hands, and whatever personal devastation he was carrying behind those iron-gray eyes, the king in him had already made the calculation. She was the variable that had to be removed. The tournament's semifinal trial was announced at noon. 8 candidates remained. The trial would take place in the Grand Council chamber, a political simulation more complex than any of the previous rounds, requiring each candidate to navigate a fabricated diplomatic crisis involving 4 fictional kingdoms, a disputed territory, and a betrayal within the alliance structure. The judges would be the full royal council, 17 men and women whose combined political experience spanned 6 decades. Seraphine arrived at the chamber to find the other 7 candidates already seated. Thessara occupied the far end of the table, her posture perfect, her expression carrying the calm assurance of someone who knew something everyone else did not. She did not look at Seraphine when she entered. She did not need to. Her presence was its own message. The trial ran for 9 hours. Each candidate was given a kingdom to represent, a set of resources, a roster of allies, and a crisis that demanded resolution within a fixed number of rounds. The simulation was designed to test not just political intelligence, but psychological endurance, the ability to think clearly when the room was hot and the arguments were sharp, and the clock was a weapon wielded by the judges themselves. Seraphine drew the weakest position, the smallest kingdom, the fewest resources, the most vulnerable borders. Whether the assignment was random or deliberate, she would never know, but the effect was the same. She entered the simulation as the underdog in a room where every other player had been bred for exactly this kind of warfare. She played the only strategy available to her. She did not try to win. She tried to survive. She formed an alliance with the 2 candidates whose kingdoms bordered hers, a fragile, transactional partnership built on shared vulnerability rather than shared strength. She traded resources she could not afford to lose in exchange for intelligence she could not afford to miss. She made herself useful to the larger powers without making herself dependent, and when the betrayal came, because the simulation was designed to guarantee one, she absorbed the blow and redirected. Not perfectly, Not gracefully, but effectively. At the end of 9 hours, 3 more candidates had been eliminated. 5 remained. Seraphine was among them, and Thesara, who had dominated the simulation from the first round, looked at her across the table with an expression that had shifted from dismissal to something more dangerous. Recognition. The Northern Duke's daughter had expected Seraphine to be eliminated by the politics. She had not expected her to adapt. An adaptation, in the world Thesara inhabited, was not a skill. It was a threat. The summons came after dark. Not from Raylor, from Lucien. A servant delivered the message to the healer's quarters. A folded piece of parchment sealed with the prince's personal signet, the words inside written in his own hand rather than a scribe's. 2 lines. The prince's private study. Immediately. Seraphine changed into clean clothes, washed the sweat from her face, and walked to the royal wing for the second time since this had all begun. This time she did not get lost. Lucien's study was smaller than his father's library, but similarly cluttered. Maps on the walls, books stacked on every surface, a writing desk positioned beneath a window that overlooked the tournament grounds below. The prince stood at that window with his back to the door, and when Seraphine entered, he did not turn around. She had seen that posture before, on a different man in a different room, what felt like a lifetime ago. Close the door. She did. Lucien turned. He looked older than his 24 years. The boyish ease that had defined him since childhood replaced by something harder, more angular, as if the discovery in the library had sanded away a layer of him and left the raw grain exposed. How long? His voice was level, controlled, but the control was visible, like a crack sealed with wax. Smooth on the surface, fragile underneath. Nothing happened before that night. That is not what I asked. He crossed his arms. The gesture was his father's, but the same defensive architecture, the same instinct to contain, and the resemblance hit Seraphine like a blow to the sternum. How long have you had feelings for him? She owed him the truth. Not because he demanded it, but because he deserved it, and because the version of herself that would have lied, the version that apologized and shrank and made herself smaller to avoid discomfort, had been dismantled in a training yard by the very man they were discussing. I do not know when it started. I did not plan it. I did not want it. I walked into his room by accident, and everything after that— She stopped, drew a breath. Everything after that was not what I thought it was. You entered the tournament for me. Yes. And somewhere between the first day and now, you stopped fighting for me and started fighting because of him. The accuracy of the statement was surgical. It opened something in her chest that she had been holding shut with both hands. Yes. Lucien nodded, not in acceptance, in confirmation. The nod of a man verifying a diagnosis he had already made. He moved to the desk, braced both hands against it, and stared down at the map beneath his palms. His knuckles were white. Do you know what Thesara told me before we walked into that library? Seraphine's stomach tightened. No. She told me that she had seen you entering the king's private quarters 3 nights in a row, that the training sessions were a cover, that my father had been cultivating a relationship with a tournament candidate, a candidate competing for my hand, behind my back, deliberately, since the beginning. Lucien's voice cracked on the word deliberately, and the crack was worse than shouting. She presented it as concern for the integrity of the tournament, but you and I both know what it actually was. A weapon. The most precise weapon I have ever seen deployed in this palace, and I have lived here my entire life. He looked up at her. His golden eyes were steady, but the steadiness was costing him. She could see the effort in the tendons of his neck, the slight tremor in his left hand, the way his jaw worked beneath the skin as if chewing through something that would not break down. My father is the most strategic man alive. He does not make mistakes. He does not lose control. He does not— He stopped, swallowed. He does not fall in love. Lucien. But he did, and you did. And I am standing here trying to figure out whether I lost something real or whether I am grieving a version of my life that was never going to exist. He straightened, dropped his hands from the desk. His expression settled into something that was not forgiveness and not anger, But a third thing, a quiet, exhausted clarity. I am withdrawing my claim. What? Not from the tournament, from you. He held up a hand before she could speak. I never made a formal claim. We both know that. But the implication was there, the friendship, the history, the expectation that if you won, I would choose you because choosing you would have been easy and kind and the thing that felt most like coming home. His mouth twisted. I am not going to compete with my father for a woman's heart. Not because I could not, but because I should not have to, and neither should you. The room was very quiet. The tournament grounds below the window were empty, the training posts casting long shadows in the torchlight. What happens now? Seraphine asked. The tournament continues. You have 2 trials left. Whether you win or lose, the political reality has already shifted. The Thesara holds the information. She will use it when it serves her, and it will serve her best at the moment of maximum impact. Lucien moved toward the door, stopped, turned back. My father is a great king. I have spent my entire life believing that. But I watched him stand in that library with you, and for the first time I realized something. What? Being a great king and being a whole man are not the same thing, and he has been one at the expense of the other for so long that he does not know how to be both. Lucien opened the door. I hope you are worth what this is going to cost him. He left. Seraphine stood in the prince's empty study and felt the architecture of everything she had understood about loyalty, about love, about the clean lines between right and wrong, collapse into a landscape she did not recognize. The Royal Moonball was 2 nights away. One semi-final trial remained, the combat exhibition. Each of the 5 remaining candidates would face a selected opponent in a formal bout before the full court. Not to the death, not even to serious injury. But the exhibition was designed to reveal character under pressure, and the court would watch every flinch, every hesitation, every moment of weakness, with the predatory attention of people whose survival depended on reading others accurately. Seraphine trained alone in the yard that night. No raylor, no instruction. Just the cracked practice post and a wooden sword and the moon throwing cold light across the stones. She swung until her arms burned, until the blisters on her palms opened and the blood made the hilt slippery and she had to adjust her grip to compensate. She swung until the rhythm of impact became automatic and her mind cleared enough to think. The Thesara would strike at the moonball. Not before. The moonball was the culmination. Every noble house, every allied kingdom, every political power in the empire gathered in one room, maximum audience, maximum damage. She would reveal the king's secret at the precise moment when revelation would do the most harm. And Raylor, isolated, silent, trapped between the crown he carried and the woman he wanted, would have no defense. Because the truth was not a lie. The truth was that the Alpha King of Aurelion had fallen in love with a healer's daughter and trained her in secret and kissed her in a library while his son's tournament raged below. The truth was a siege weapon, and Thesara had loaded it. Seraphine stopped swinging. She stood in the center of the yard, chest heaving, blood cooling on her palms, and made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like a mutation. The kind of fundamental shift that happens when an organism realizes the environment it evolved for no longer exists and the only options are adapt or die. She would not wait for Thesara to strike. She would not hide. She would not apologize or shrink or make herself smaller to fit the space the court had allocated for someone of her station. She would walk into the combat exhibition and she would fight. And then she would walk into the moonball and she would stand in front of the entire kingdom and she would make the truth her own weapon before Thesara could use it as someone else's. The decision burned through her like a fever breaking. She felt it in her bones, in her blood, in the raw and ruined skin of her hands. It was not courage. Courage implied a choice between safety and danger. This was something more primitive, more necessary. The survival response of a woman who had finally understood that the greatest threat to her existence was not the enemies around her, but the version of herself that had spent 23 years asking for permission to take up space. That woman was dead. She had died in a king's library with the taste of iron and midnight on her lips. Whatever rose in her place would not ask permission. The combat exhibition drew the largest crowd of the tournament. The grand arena. an oval of packed earth surrounded by tiered stone seating, filled with nobles, merchants, soldiers, servants, and every foreign delegation that had traveled to Aurelion for the spectacle. The noise was immense, a living thing that pulsed and shifted with the crowd's collective hunger for blood and drama and the visceral satisfaction of watching other people fight. Seraphine drew the fourth bout. Her opponent was Lady Emrys Caulfield, daughter of the Southern Reach commander, taller by 4 inches, heavier by 20 pounds, and carrying the lean corded muscle of a woman who had trained with live steel since she could walk. The bout was 3 rounds, wooden swords, full contact, first to 3 clean strikes or submission. Seraphine entered the arena in her borrowed trousers and tunic, hair tied back, hands wrapped in linen strips to cover the cuts. No armor, no insignia, no house colors. She looked like what she was, a woman who had walked in from the margins of the world and refused to walk back out. The crowd noise dipped when she stepped onto the packed earth. Not silence, something more uncomfortable. Confusion. The murmur of people who did not know where to put her in their hierarchy and resented her for the uncertainty. She looked up at the royal balcony. Raylor sat in the king's seat, flanked by Aldrich on one side and 2 senior council members on the other. His face was carved from granite. His hands gripped the arms of the chair with a force that turned his knuckles bone white. He had not spoken to her in 3 days, had not looked at her, had not entered the training yard, had sealed himself behind the walls of kingship so completely that the man she had kissed in the library might as well have been a ghost. But he was watching now. His iron-gray eyes tracked her as she moved to the center of the arena, and in them she saw something that cut deeper than any weapon in the building. He was terrified. Not for the kingdom, not for his reputation. For her. For the body standing on packed earth about to take blows it was not built to absorb. For the hands that had healed his soldiers and touched his face and would now be gripping a weapon against an opponent who outclassed her in every measurable way. The Alpha King of Aurelion was watching the woman he loved walk into a fight she was supposed to lose, and every fiber of his being was screaming at him to stop it, and he could not. Because stopping it would confirm Thesara's story. Because stopping it would end Seraphine's place in the tournament. Because the machinery of power did not care about love, and the man who had built that machinery was now trapped inside it. Seraphine held his gaze for 1 heartbeat. 2. Then she turned to face Emrys Caulfield, raised her wooden sword, and set her feet in the stance Raylor had taught her on a cold morning that felt like 100 years ago. The first round lasted 40 seconds. Emrys came in hard, a driving overhand strike followed by a lateral sweep designed to take Seraphine's legs. Seraphine blocked the overhand but missed the sweep entirely. The wooden blade cracked against her left thigh, hard enough to buckle her knee, and she hit the dirt with her hip, tasting dust and the copper tang of a bitten tongue. 1 strike to 0. The crowd reacted, not cheering, assessing. Seraphine got up. Her thigh screamed. The muscle would bruise deep enough to change the color of the skin for weeks. She shifted her weight to her right leg, adjusted her grip, and waited. Emrys came again. Same pattern. High strike, low sweep. The woman fought like a textbook because the textbook had always worked. This time Seraphine did not try to block the overhand. She stepped inside it, moved toward the attack instead of away from it, closing the distance so fast that Emrys's swing passed over her shoulder and the taller woman's momentum carried her forward into the space Seraphine had just vacated. In that half second of overextension, that tiny window of vulnerability that only existed because Seraphine had been willing to let the first blow land to learn the pattern, she drove the tip of her wooden sword into the gap between Emrys's ribs and hip. Clean strike, 1-1. The arena went quiet, then loud, then quiet again, as if the crowd itself could not decide what it had just witnessed. Emrys reset. Her expression had changed. The confidence was still there, but layered now with something harder, wariness. The look of a fighter who had just realized the person across from her was not fighting by the rules she understood. The second round lasted longer. Emrys adjusted, using her reach advantage to keep Seraphine at distance, probing with quick strikes designed to test reactions without committing. Seraphine stayed low, stayed patient, let her body absorb the rhythm the way a healer absorbs a patient's pulse, reading the intervals, the pressure, the tiny inconsistencies that revealed what was coming next. The strike came, a faint high, a commit low, a spinning backhand that Emrys had clearly practiced 1,000 times in controlled environments. Seraphine took the feint on her forearm, a glancing blow that stung but did not score, and stepped left instead of right. The backhand whistled through empty air. Emrys's back was exposed for less than a second. Seraphine's sword caught her between the shoulder blades. Not hard, clean, 2-1. The crowd was on its feet now, not all of them in support. Many faces in the noble sections carried the tight, furious expression of people watching an outcome they had not authorized. But enough. Enough noise. Enough energy. Enough raw, surprised investment in the improbable survival of a woman who had no business being alive in this arena. Emrys charged the third round, abandoned strategy, abandoned patience, came in with the full-bore aggression of a fighter who understood that losing to a healer's daughter in front of the entire kingdom would define her for the rest of her life. The exchange was brutal, fast, 5 strikes in 3 seconds, wooden blades cracking against each other with a sound like bones breaking. Seraphine blocked 3, deflected 1. The 5th caught her across the collarbone and sent her stumbling backward, her vision white-edged with pain, her left arm suddenly numb from shoulder to fingertip. 2-2. Her collarbone was not broken. She knew that the way she knew her own name. The pain was wrong for a fracture. Deep bruise. Possible hairline crack, but the arm still moved, and the hand still gripped, and the body still stood. Emrys circled, breathing hard now, sweat cutting lines through the dust on her face. She was stronger, faster, better trained. But she was fighting a woman who had spent the last 2 weeks learning that the difference between surviving and dying was never about strength. It was about deciding what you were willing to lose to keep what mattered. Seraphine shifted her sword to her right hand only, let her left arm drop. The arena gasped, an audible collective intake of breath that rolled through the stands like a wave. She was giving up her guard, deliberately, offering her wounded side as a target while concentrating everything she had into a single striking hand. Emrys hesitated. For 1/2 second, one critical, fight-ending half-second, she hesitated because the move made no tactical sense and her training had not prepared her for an opponent who would voluntarily become more vulnerable. In that half-second, Seraphine lunged. Not at Emrys's body, at her sword hand. The wooden blade struck the inside of Emrys's wrist with a precision that came from years of setting bones and aligning joints and understanding exactly where the tendons were thinnest and the grip was weakest. Emrys's sword clattered to the packed earth. Disarm, clean, irrevocable. The arena erupted. Seraphine stood in the center of the packed earth, one arm useless, the other trembling, blood from her bitten tongue staining her teeth, dust coating every inch of her body, and the wooden sword still raised in a grip that was shaking so badly the blade vibrated. She looked up at the royal balcony. Raylor was standing, not clapping, not cheering, standing with both hands gripping the railing and his jaw locked and his iron-gray eyes burning with something so raw and so undeniable that every person in the first 3 rows of the arena could see it. And every person who could see it understood in that instant exactly what Lady Thessera Morvain had been whispering about for 3 days. The king was in love with the healer's daughter, and the moonball was tomorrow night. The night before the moonball, Seraphine sat on the floor of the healer's quarters, with her back against the wall, and her injured arm cradled across her chest, and the wooden sword propped beside her like a companion that had nothing left to say. The collarbone was not broken. She had checked it herself, fingers probing the bone with the clinical detachment of a woman who had spent years treating bodies worse off than her own. Deep bruise, swelling along the ridge, pain that spiked when she lifted the arm above her shoulder and settled into a dull, constant throb when she let it rest. She could work with pain. Pain was honest. Pain did not whisper rumors in corridors, or deploy political intelligence at strategic intervals, or stand in doorways with calculating eyes and a sealed marriage proposal from the Northern Duchy. Pain just hurt, and hurting was something she understood. The knock came after midnight, soft. 2 raps. A pause. Then a third. She opened the door and found Aldrich standing in the corridor, his gray head bowed, his hands clasped in front of him with the careful stillness of a man delivering something fragile. "The king requests your presence. Now? Now." She followed him through the sleeping palace, through corridors she knew by heart now, past guard stations that watched her pass with expressions she could no longer read, up the western stairwell to the tower library where everything had changed and nothing had been fixed. Raylor stood at the window. The same window, the same moonlight, the same silhouette of a man who carried an empire on his back and could not carry the weight of his own wanting without the architecture of his entire life threatening to buckle. Aldrich closed the door from the outside and was gone. The silence lasted a long time, long enough for Seraphine to count her own heartbeats and notice that they were steady. That surprised her. 3 weeks ago, standing in this room would have made her tremble. Now the trembling was gone, replaced by something harder and quieter. The stillness of a woman who had already survived the worst thing the palace could throw at her and was standing upright on the other side. "I watched you fight today." Raylor's voice was rough. Not the controlled roughness of command, but the raw roughness of a man who had been silent for too long and whose voice had forgotten how to carry anything except the truth. "I watched you take that first hit and go down, and I could not breathe. I sat in that chair with 17 council members and 400 spectators, and the entirety of the northern delegation 3 rows behind me, and I could not draw air into my lungs because the woman I—" He stopped. His hands, braced against the window ledge, were shaking. "Because you were on the ground." I got up. "You got up." A sound escaped him, not a laugh, not a sob, something caught between the two like a bone lodged in the throat. "You got up, and you fought with one arm, and you won. And every person in that arena saw my face and knew. Yes, Thessara will use it, tomorrow night, in front of every power that matters." "I know." He turned from the window. The moonlight showed her what 3 days of separation had done to him. The hollows beneath his eyes, the deeper lines bracketing his mouth, the gray at his temples that seemed to have advanced like a border creeping inward. He looked like a man who had been at war with himself and both sides were losing. "I have spent 17 years making every decision based on what the kingdom required. Every alliance, every treaty, every concession, and every conquest. I built this empire by subordinating everything personal to everything strategic, and I was good at it. I was so good at it that I forgot there was a difference between the man and the mechanism." He crossed the room, slow, deliberate. Each step a decision he was making in real time, as if the distance between the window and the place where she stood was a border he had to choose to cross. "And then you walked through my door, and the mechanism broke." "Raylor, let me finish. Because I have been silent for 3 days, and if I do not say this now, the king will take over again, and the king will do what the king always does. He will calculate. He will strategize. He will find the optimal move and execute it, and lose the only thing that has ever made the crown worth wearing." He stopped an arm's length from her, close enough to touch. Not touching. "I am going to the moon ball tomorrow night, and I am going to do something that no strategic mind in this kingdom would advise." "What?" "The truth." His eyes held hers, and in them she saw the thing that had been building since the first morning in the training yard. Not just love, not just desire, but the ferocious, terrifying commitment of a man who had finally decided that the cost of silence was higher than the cost of everything silence was supposed to protect. Before Thessara can weaponize it, before the council can frame it, before anyone in that room can turn what I feel into a scandal or a strategy or a footnote in someone else's political campaign, I'm going to stand in front of the entire kingdom and I'm going to tell them. Seraphine's breath left her in a rush that felt like the release of something she had been holding for weeks. They will call it weakness. Let them. The Northern Duchy will withdraw the alliance proposal. The border held for 4 generations before Thessara's father decided a marriage was cheaper than a garrison. It will hold again. His hand rose, slowly, giving her every chance to step back, to turn away, to choose the safer path. His fingers touched her jaw. Barely. The contact so light it was more heat than pressure. and the roughness of his calluses against her skin sent a shudder through her that started at the point of contact and did not stop. "You could lose everything," she whispered. "I already lost everything. 3 days ago, in this room, when I watched you walk out and I let you go because the king told me to. The king was wrong." His thumb traced the line of her jaw, and his voice dropped to something barely above a breath. "The king has been wrong about this for years." She reached up and closed her hand over his, pressed his palm flat against her cheek, held it there. "Then we go together," she said. "Tomorrow night. No hiding, no strategy, no calculation. Together." The word hung between them like something newly forged, still hot, still glowing, not yet tested against the weight it would need to bear, but solid, real. The first honest thing either of them had built in weeks. She did not stay. There was nothing to be gained by staying and everything to be lost if someone found her there before morning. But when she left the library, she carried with her the warmth of his hand on her face and the sound of his voice saying the word together like a man who had just remembered what it meant to not be alone. The royal moonball filled the grand hall with light and noise, and the dangerous electricity of 500 powerful people gathered in one room with competing agendas. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling like frozen constellations, throwing prismatic light across marble floors and silk gowns and the polished steel of ceremonial armor. Silver banners bearing the sigils of every noble house in the kingdom lined the walls, iron gray and black for the crown, deep blue for the prince's house, and at the far end of the hall, the stark white and silver of the northern duchy. The Sarah Morvain stood beneath her house banner in a gown of white silk over steel gray armor plate, a deliberate fusion of political elegance and military authority that told everyone in the room exactly what she considered herself to be. Not a candidate, a conqueror. She held a crystal glass and spoke with 3 members of the royal council, and the smile on her face was the smile of a woman who had already won and was simply waiting for the room to catch up. Seraphine entered through the main doors. She wore a gown she had not owned 12 hours ago. Deep green, the color of the ashwood canopy, simple in cut, but striking in the way it moved when she walked, as if the fabric itself had decided to cooperate. Aldrich had delivered it to her quarters that morning without explanation or attribution, though the quality of the stitching and the precision of the fit told her everything she needed to know about who had commissioned it. The hall noticed her immediately. Heads turned. Whispers cascaded through the crowd like wind through tall grass. The healer's daughter. The commoner who had fought her way to the final 5. The woman at the center of a rumor that had been circulating for 3 days with the persistence of smoke in a sealed room. She walked through the center of the hall without stopping, without scanning the crowd for allies or threats, without adjusting her expression to meet the expectations of the room. She walked like a woman who had stopped asking for permission to occupy space, because asking had never worked and demanding had never been an option, and the only thing left was simply being present with enough conviction that the space rearranged itself around her. Lucien found her near the east wall. He looked magnificent, royal blue and silver, his golden hair brushed back, his bearing carrying the practiced ease of a man born to stand in rooms like this. But his eyes were different. The warmth was still there, but it had been reorganized, sharpened. The eyes of a man who had processed something painful and come out the other side with a clarity he had not possessed before. "You look well," he said. "You look like a prince." "Is that a compliment or an observation?" "Both." She met his gaze. "Lucien, whatever happens tonight, I know." He took her hand, brief, a squeeze that communicated more than any sentence could have. "I made my peace with it. Not because it does not hurt, because the hurt is not the whole story." He released her hand. "My father is a hard man to love, but he is worth it. And you are the first person I have ever seen who is hard enough to love him back." He walked away into the crowd, and Seraphine watched him go with the piercing awareness that the boy she had loved for 9 years had just become a man she respected more than almost anyone she had ever known. The ceremony began at the 9th hour. The royal herald called the court to attention. The 5 remaining candidates assembled in a line at the center of the hall, the Sarah at one end, Seraphine at the other, 3 noble daughters between them, each carrying the posture and pedigree of a lifetime's preparation. The protocol was ancient and specific. Each candidate would be presented to the crown prince. Lucian would acknowledge each in turn. At the conclusion, he would announce his chosen Luna before the assembled court, and the claiming bond would be sealed in front of witnesses. But the protocol assumed a simple narrative: one prince, one choice, one future. The narrative had not been simple for weeks. Thesara made her move before the first candidate was presented. She stepped forward, out of line, breaking protocol with the deliberate precision of someone who had calculated exactly how much disruption was needed and exactly when to deploy it, and addressed the hall. Before the ceremony proceeds, I must speak to a matter of integrity that affects every person in this room. Her voice filled the space with the clarity and command of a woman who had been raised to project across battlefields. She turned to face the royal dais where Raylor sat. Your Majesty, for the duration of this tournament, you have conducted a private relationship with one of the candidates competing for your son's hand. You trained her in secret. You met with her behind closed doors, and the evidence suggests that this relationship has compromised the fairness of every trial she has participated in. The hall went silent. Not the gradual quiet of fading conversation, but the instantaneous, vacuum-sealed silence of 500 people simultaneously holding their breath. Thesara continued, her voice steady, her posture impeccable, every word aimed with surgical precision. I raise this not out of personal interest, but out of obligation to the integrity of the tournament and the honor of the crown. The kingdom deserves to know. The kingdom knows. Raylor's voice cut through the hall like a blade through silk. Not loud, not aggressive, but carrying the absolute authority of a man who had spent 17 years training rooms to listen when he spoke. He stood. The movement was slow, deliberate, carrying the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. He descended from the dais. 1 step, 2, 3. His boots struck the marble floor with a cadence that echoed through the silent hall like a heartbeat. He walked past the council members, past the noble houses, past the ambassadors and the foreign delegations, and the military commanders who had followed him into 6 campaigns, and never once seen him do anything that was not calculated 3 moves in advance. He stopped in the center of the hall, turned to face the court. Lady Morvain is correct. His voice filled every corner of the room. I trained Seraphine Vale, in private, without authorization from the council or disclosure to the tournament committee. I did this because I am her king and her mentor, and because her preparation served the interest of a fair competition. He paused, let the words settle, then continued, and his voice changed, dropped, roughened, shed the formal register like armor being unbuckled after a long siege. And I did this because I am in love with her. I have been in love with her for longer than I had the courage to admit, and I am done pretending otherwise. The silence held. 500 people, not a breath. The tournament for the Crown Prince's Luna will conclude as planned. My son will choose his partner according to the protocol established by this court, but I am not my son. And the choice I make tonight is my own. He turned, found Seraphine in the line of candidates, looked at her with those iron-gray eyes that she had learned to read the way she read a body's vital signs, the pulse beneath the surface, the pressure building, the strength that held when everything else gave way. I choose her, not as a strategy, not as an alliance, as my Luna, as my equal, as the woman who walked into the wrong room and changed the entire direction of my life. He extended his hand. The hall erupted, not into cheers, into chaos. Voices overlapping, noble houses turning to each other in shock and calculation, council members rising from their seats, Thesara standing frozen in the center of her own interrupted accusation with an expression that cycled from triumph to confusion, to the slow, dawning realization that the weapon she had spent days preparing had just been detonated by its target, and the blast had gone in a direction she did not anticipate. Seraphine stepped out of line, walked to the center of the hall. The green dress moved around her like the ash would come alive, and her hands, calloused, scarred, blistered, healer's hands that had been rebuilt in a training yard by a man who refused to let her apologize for being strong, took the king's outstretched hand and held it. not gently, firmly. The grip of a woman who had learned that holding on was harder than letting go and had chosen the harder thing. Lucien stepped forward from the royal dais. The hall quieted. Not fully, not yet, but enough. He surveyed the remaining candidates with the clear-eyed calm of a man who had already made his decision in a quieter room on a quieter night. "Lady Emrys Caulfield," he said. His voice carried the same authority as his father's, the same weight, the same command, but warmer, steadier. The voice of a king who would lead differently than the one before him, not because the old way was wrong, but because the new way was his. "I have watched you throughout this tournament. Your strength, your honor, your refusal to break under pressure. I would be proud to have you stand beside me." Emrys stepped forward. Her expression was stunned, then fierce, then something softer that she allowed the court to see for exactly 2 seconds before her composure returned. She took Lucien's hand. The hall processed 2 claims in the space of 30 seconds. Father and son, standing 10 feet apart, each holding the hand of the woman they had chosen. The symmetry was not planned. It simply happened. The way rain happens, the way tides happen, the way 2 people who have spent their lives building walls sometimes arrive at the same moment of demolition and discover that what was behind the walls was worth more than what the walls protected. The Sarah Morvain stood in the hall with her white silk and her steel armor and her northern duke's ambition and watched the ground shift beneath her feet. She had come to Aurelion to claim a king. She had deployed intelligence and strategy and the ruthless precision of a woman raised in the most unforgiving territory in the empire. And she had lost. Not because her plan was flawed, but because the man she was trying to control had done the one thing no strategic mind could predict. He had stopped calculating. She inclined her head, that same not quite bow, and walked from the hall with her spine straight and her stride even, and the expression of someone already recalculating the next campaign. The northern border would hold. It had always held. And Lady Thessara Morvain was not the kind of woman who stayed defeated. But tonight was not her night. Tonight belonged to the healer's daughter and the king who had spent 17 years building an empire and had finally discovered that the most important thing he would ever build was a bridge between who he was and who he wanted to be. They stood on the balcony after midnight, Raylor and Seraphine, overlooking the palace grounds where celebration fires burned in iron braziers and the sound of music drifted up from the courtyards below. The air was cold. The stars were sharp. The kingdom stretched beyond the walls into darkness, and somewhere out there, in every province and every village and every outpost along the borders he had fought to establish, the world was continuing its relentless, indifferent turning. Raylor stood with his hands on the railing, the crown removed, his jacket unbuttoned, looking more human than she had ever seen him. The scars on his forearms caught the firelight. The silver in his hair glowed. His breathing was slow and deep, the breathing of a man who had set down a weight he had been carrying for so long that his body did not yet understand it was allowed to straighten. "They will challenge it," he said. "The council, the allied houses. There will be opposition." "I know. It will not be easy. Any of it. The court is a machine designed to grind down anything that does not fit its specifications, and you do not fit a single one." "I know that too." He looked at her. The iron-gray eyes were softer now. Not weak, never weak, but open in a way she had not seen before, unguarded. The eyes of a man who had decided that vulnerability was not the opposite of strength, but the proof of it. "Are you afraid?" She thought about it, genuinely thought about it. Not the reflexive no that bravery demanded, but the honest assessment of a woman who had walked through every kind of fear the palace could manufacture and was still standing. "Yes," she said, "but I have been afraid since the night I knocked on your door. The fear has not stopped me yet." His mouth curved. Not quite a smile. Something older. Something earned. The expression of a man who had lived long enough to know that the things worth having were never the things that came easily, and that the measure of a life was not the battles won, but the willingness to keep standing in the space between what the world expected and what the heart demanded. He pulled her close. Not with the desperate urgency of the library, with something quieter and more permanent, the steady, deliberate embrace of a man holding something he intended to keep, I have conquered 6 provinces, he said into her hair, survived 3 rebellions, held an empire together through drought and war and the kind of political treachery that would have broken most men before their 30th year. His arms tightened around her. And the bravest thing I have ever done was stand in that hall tonight and say your name. She pressed her face against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, steady, strong, no longer the controlled rhythm of a king managing his own pulse, but the natural, unguarded beating of a man who had finally stopped fighting the only war he was never going to win. Below them, the celebration continued. Fires burning, music playing, a kingdom adjusting to a new reality that no one had predicted and no one could undo. Above them, the stars did what stars do, burned and burned and burned, indifferent to the small, extraordinary dramas of the people beneath them, offering no judgment and no guidance, just the ancient, patient light of things that had been burning long before any empire rose and would keep burning long after every empire fell. Seraphine lifted her head, looked at the man who held her, saw every scar, every line, every year of sacrifice carved into the face that the kingdom feared, and she had learned to read like a language only she could speak. "The wrong door," she said. "The wrong door," he agreed. And for the first time in 17 years, the Alpha King of Aurelian smiled, not for the court, not for the council, not for the carefully maintained architecture of power that had defined his entire adult life, but for her, only for her. A smile so rare and so unguarded that it changed the shape of his face entirely. And Seraphine understood in that moment that this was the man beneath the monument. This was what the crown had been hiding. This was what she had been fighting for without knowing it, from the first night she knocked on the wrong door to the last night she would ever have to stand alone. The fires burned low. The music faded. Dawn crept over the eastern wall of the palace, turning the stone to gold, and the longest night in the history of Aurelian gave way to a morning that belonged to no one's plan and no one's strategy and no one's careful calculation. It belonged to them. This is a work of fiction created solely for artistic storytelling and entertainment purposes.